Bryce Greene, a regular guest of ours, a very popular one too, is an independent writer, political analyst, contributor to Fairness. Wouldn't fairness be a fine thing? Bryce, you were probably startled by my description of what's happening in England today because, well, it's the kind of thing that we used to cluck about happening in the United States. Race riots in 2024 in England. Has that news reached you over there yet?
I've only heard the briefest accounts, but it doesn't surprise me that Britain would be having race issues. The entire Brexit campaign seemed to be an example of capitalizing on racial discrimination and racial biases against immigrants and people of color. And this is nothing less than what I would expect from one of the chief countries of what I like to call the white power axis. You know, UK, the United States, and Australia, and all these other European countries that are hell-bent on taking over the world.
Actually, the free movement of foreign labour that was being rejected by the vote on Brexit were all white people. So whatever else it was a rejection of white Eastern European cheap labour, not of people of colour. There are millions of people of colour in our country. Most of them were born there. And if they weren't in the England football team, they'd have gone out in the first round. Everyone is eating in Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi restaurants, listening to black people's music. And every football team in Britain, every one in England, has at least 2, 3, oftentimes 7, 8 black players in their team. And yet the same people that eat in those restaurants, buy that music, support those football teams, are now roaming around English cities looking for people who look like you to pull out of their car and severely assault. And God forbid, it's only a matter of time before somebody's killed. It's a truly shocking thing for us in Britain. And the fact that we don't have enough cops to defend the places that are under attack is a big wake-up call, a big shock to those that didn't notice the steady reduction in police numbers in Britain over this last period. But you've got your border issues too, don't you? You had a border czar, Kamala Harris, I think she was called. What's happening down there?
Well, here in the United States, it seems that immigration has become a bipartisan issue in which everyone on every side of the aisle agrees that they want to keep the immigrants out. But the immigration crisis is one born of American imperialism, just like many other issues around the world. The fact that America has destroyed countries like Mexico, like Honduras, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, through sanctions or other forms of economic warfare, has caused a steady stream of migrants headed northward looking for a better life. But the Americans don't seem to care about that. They seem to only care about the issue when it reaches their borders. But if they wanted to stem the tide of immigrants, they could stop destroying other countries. And Kamala, even if she might be offering an alternative to Joe Biden, seems pretty committed to continuing America's role in Latin America, America's role in the rest of the world. One only need look at the recent elections in Venezuela to see how this political system would react to any radical change that would change the conditions of people's lives on the ground in Central America. The Maduro government appears to have won an election, but of course, Western imperialist powers have been delegitimizing the election, which is what they do whenever an election happens in a country that they don't like. But much like they did under Trump, the U.S. government seems to be trying to recognize the other government, thus contributing to the political destabilization, justifying another round of economic sanctions, which compounds the political situation there. None of this is going to help Venezuela. None of this is going to keep people from wanting to come north. All of it's going to exacerbate the problem. And when people flee in millions and millions, they'll act surprised when they decide to come to America, which, for all its problems, is still a relatively rich part of the world.
It is ironic, isn't it, that a state founded on the mass immigration of settlers who then exterminated the local population, enslaved millions of Africans, should be complaining about invaders coming from the south, given everything you've just said. And I could say even more about the war and depredation they have wrought upon their backyard, as Monroe put it, in the southern part of the American hemisphere. It's as ironic as Britain, which invaded 3/4 of the world. There's only 40 countries in the whole world that Britain has not invaded and occupied, and for centuries in some cases, and was, of course, the biggest trader of slaves to the Americas. Now we're all upset about 0.18% of our population being invaders who've arrived here illegally, like we legally arrived in India or Africa or Asia or the Middle East.
Well, precisely. It is exactly irony that's what's at play here. One of the funny things, George, is that when I was in elementary school, middle school, learning about our history, we would learn about the Monroe Doctrine. And in America, the Monroe Doctrine is taught to us as a way to protect the Southern Hemisphere or the Western Hemisphere from European colonialism. There was no mention of American colonialism. There was no mention that the fact that the U.S. is claiming all of these countries is a way for them to exploit their resources and change the governments and extract as much wealth as possible. But that's the sort of history that people are grown up with. And so it's no surprise that they have these skewed ideas about whose land it is and who's an invader and who belongs here. And I'm certain that the educational system over there in the UK is equally as skewed towards, again, this white power axis. These narratives of whose land it is and who's in the right, and well, do Indians belong here? Did Britain legally go into India? All of these questions have real historical answers, but educational systems in many countries around the world spend a lot of energy in trying to obscure this reality and in trying to play on people's nativist sentiments. And I think based on what you're telling me, that's what we're seeing in the UK right now, these roving gangs of the ignorant fighting the enemy that they've been told is replacing them. But it's all nonsense, and it's all based on the original sin of the colonialist empire.
Now, are your people aware that tonight probably a conflagration will begin, and that your government, whoever they are, we don't actually know who's running things in Washington right now, your government has sent 4,000 Marines, sent your warships to the Eastern Mediterranean, which can only mean an intervention in the war that's about to break out overnight tonight. Are the American public aware that their sons and presumably some daughters are steaming towards their own death for Israel, and how do they feel about it?
Well, as usual, most of the American public doesn't quite understand what the issues at stake are. They understand that Israel's under attack and that Israel's an ally, and so America needs to defend their ally. However, what's little discussed here is just how precarious the situation in the Middle East is, and just how destructive Israel's role in the Middle East is. People don't see the fact that Israel, in its entire colonial enterprise and its entire enterprise of occupation in Gaza and the West Bank, is at the root of the current war that we see now. They don't see that Israel's insistence on expansion into the Golan Heights, into the West Bank, into other areas, is why the surrounding Arab states don't approve of their continued aggressive behavior. And they certainly don't understand how endangered Israel is right now. There's this myth that Israel is an iron fortress backed by Big Brother, the United States, but that seems to be increasingly blowing up in their face. Many Israeli generals seem to understand that they can't really fight a war on two fronts against Hezbollah and Hamas. They're only recently now acknowledging the ammunition and tank shortages that have been resulting from their war against Hamas. Those challenges will only be compounded when 30,000 Hezbollah fighters are up against the IDF. And those problems will only be further compounded if Iran sends troops to get involved. And again, they'll be further compounded if the Houthis decide to send more missiles, which, as we've seen over the last few weeks, are very capable of hitting Tel Aviv. So there's this myth of American invincibility, of Israeli invincibility, and it's slowly being shattered. But if America allows Israel, and I do say allow because they have the ability to stop it, but if America allows Israel to start this broader war in Lebanon and Iran and to continue bombing sovereign nations, then they're in for a rude awakening. It seems to be another example of this irony we're talking about, this ignorant irony, that the biggest people who are pushing for an agenda that would lead to the destruction of Israel happen to call themselves Israel's biggest supporters. They happen to be the settlers, the ultra-ideological Zionists who are pushing for a broader expansion into war. But as we've seen in the case of South Africa or any dying empire, lashing out this way is really the surest path to destruction.
Lastly, Bryce, I'm grateful for your time on a busy, busy evening. How's the election going? What's your current reading of who's going to be president?
Oh, goodness. I'm not following the horse race as closely as many people, mostly because I don't find the difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump to be as significant as some other people seem to believe. There was a time when the Democrats were talking about how Trump is a threat to democracy and a threat to the rule of law. Of course, all of that's true, but they don't seem to believe that anymore. They seem to be getting highly offended at the idea of someone wishing death on Trump, which if they were a threat to democracy, well, then you would think that that wouldn't be so controversial. But no, they've pivoted from calling Trump a threat to democracy to him being weird and Republicans being weird, which, again, is true, but it ignores how much of a threat to democracy Democrats are and how weird Democrats are. And so while I am on the side that believes that Kamala Harris would be far less destructive, or at least slightly less destructive than Trump would be, at least on the domestic front, the differences between the two, especially on the foreign policy side, in which millions of lives hang in the balance, in which thousands of people are being massacred every year under the U.S. watch, that doesn't seem to change under Kamala. It didn't seem to change under Biden, and it won't change under Kamala. Didn't change under Obama. Didn't change under Clinton or any Democrat. And so these issues of which person is in the White House at any given moment seems to be secondary than to the question of who controls American foreign policy. And that question is, the major corporations, the ideologues, the imperialists, the people who want to see American power projected at any cost. And that's true regardless of the color of the party that's in office, blue, red, it doesn't matter. And so I believe that many Americans should instead focus on how they can build alternative power so that by 2028, we won't have a question of which genocidal freak we're going to put into the White House. And maybe it'll be a question of whether or not this country is going to be a democracy, whether or not it's going to represent its people, whether or not it's going to keep massacring people all around the world. And so that's the long-term political project that I think people ought to be focused on. The horse race might be interesting in its own right, but at the end of the day, it's just going to an office and clicking a button. It's not really political activity.
Thanks for that, Bryce Greene, independent writer, political analyst, and contributor to Fairness. Thanks for your time.